Welcome to our lesson on Native Americans, Cultures, and Conflicts. Earlier this year, we covered the Native Americans of the East Coast and their conflicts with the settlers in the early stages of westward expansion. Now we'll cover the Great Plains and West Coast Indians and their conflicts after the Civil War with the United States. The Indians of the Great Basin. They were in the states of Nevada, California, Idaho, Oregon, and Utah. Tribes from this area included the Bannocks, the Shoshone, the Utes, and the Paiutes. Their environment was located between the Rockies and the Sierra Nevadas. It was a hot desert climate reaching 120 degrees in the summer, with cold nights in the winter reaching as low as -20, and there was very little water. Some of their cultural practices included living in family groups. They hunted and gathered food. They generally stayed in the same area. Shamans were religious leaders, and they acquired guns and horses from the Spanish in the 1700s. Indians of the Plateau. They were in the states of Idaho, Oregon, Washington, California, Montana, and in parts of Canada. Their tribes included the Katunais, the Walla Wallas, the Coeur d'Alene, Cayusas, and Nez Perce. Their environment was located between the Rockies and Sierra Nevadas. It also was a hot desert climate, but there was more water in their region, and there was more plant and animal life than in the Great Basin. Their cultural practices included living in family groups. They hunted and gathered food. Salmon was essential to their culture. They taught children with tales of the cunning coyote. They built dwellings in large pits to keep warm during the winter months. Indians of the Plains. States they occupied included Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Wyoming, Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Texas. Tribes include the Sioux, Arapaho, Crow, Blackfoot, Comanche, Pawnee, and Cheyenne. Their environment was primarily flat grassland with few trees. Their cultural practices included that they were originally farmers, but once horses were introduced, they became fierce warriors and hunters, known best for hunting bison and never wasting any aspect of the animal. They lived in teepees. Indians of the Pacific Northwest. The states they occupied included Alaska, Washington, Oregon, California, and parts of Canada. Their tribes included the Tlingets, Salishes, Haida, and Quakituls. Their environment was that they lived along the coast where it was windy and rocky. They were bordered by mountains. It was rainy and cold compared to the other regions. Their cultural practices include they had a class structure with chiefs, nobles, and ordinary people. They were hunter-gatherers. They valued giving away property. They created elaborate totem poles. They held great ceremonies with hundreds of people called potlatches, and they built houses. Broken promises. The poor relationship between the Indians and the United States can be traced all the way back to the colonial period. While some tribes were able to get along with the early colonists, diseases from Europe and Africa took a toll on the Indians and many died. The United States gained more and more land over the years, especially with the Louisiana Purchase. As settlers moved further and further west, Indians were pushed back either by force or through deception. In the 1830s, under the order of President Andrew Jackson, the U.S. Army led over 15,000 Indians along the Trail of Tears away from their land and onto reservations. As immigrants poured in during the 19th century, many tribes were forced even further west. More and more states were added to the Union, and tribes had to share land, leading to tribal conflict. The overhunting of the bison population by recently displaced tribes and white settlers seriously affected the Plains Indians, as their main source of food was hunted almost to extinction. The gold rush pushed Indians out even more, and many tribes were relegated to reservations. Tensions rose in 1864 with the Sand Creek Massacre. Under the leadership of Colonel Chivington, troops in Denver, Colorado slaughtered over 100 Indians as a response to the death of a few settlers. An investigation was held, but none were punished. Indian Wars. After Sand Creek, most interactions between Indians and settlers were violent. Between 1792 and 1890, there were a total of 65 major battles fought between the U.S. and the Indians. In 1862, on the west coast, battles broke out between settlers and members of the Modoc tribe who refused to stay on their reservation. A band of 50 Indians were able to hold back over 1,000 soldiers before surrendering. Wars were also fought between the Plains Indians and settlers. The Sioux were the fiercest of the warriors, and for some time they prevented any settlers from moving in on their territory. General Custer. He lived from 1839 until 1876. He was born in Michigan and raised in Ohio. He attended West Point and graduated in 1858 at the bottom of his class. He served as a cavalry officer for the Union during the Civil War, where he reached the rank of captain. He fought at the First Battle of Bull Run and was present at Lee's surrender at the Appomattox Courthouse. After the Civil War, he was appointed as a lieutenant colonel in the 7th Cavalry Regiment. He was stationed in the West to help fight against the Sioux and other organized tribes in the Plains Indians Wars. Sitting Bull. He lived from 1831 until 1890. He was the chief of the Lakota people during the Indian Wars. He is famously remembered for having a vision of Custer's defeat at the Battle of Little Bighorn days before the battle. This vision inspired the United Tribes, helping them win a decisive victory over the U.S. He later toured with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and became a fan and friend of Annie Oakley. He was later arrested and subsequently shot by Indian Agency police at Standing Rock Indian Reservation, fearing that he would join something called the Ghost Dance Movement, a religious ceremony intended to bring back dead warriors for battle. Little Bighorn. From June 25th until June 26 in 1876, the U.S. 7th Cavalry Regiment engaged with the combined forces of the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes near the Little Bighorn River in the Montana Territory. The U.S. cavalry was led by George Custer, and the Indian tribes were led by Sitting Bull, Chief Gall, and Crazy Horse. Custer's force was about 700 men, while the combined forces of the tribes is estimated to have been between 2,500 and 4,000 men. The Indians won a decisive victory, killing 268 U.S. cavalrymen, including Custer himself. It became known as Custer's Last Stand. The end of the Indian Wars. In response, Americans called for more military action against the Indians. The U.S. fought against the Nez Perce under Chief Joseph and the Apache under Geronimo, both of whom surrendered. The Indians became desperate and turned to a new religious practice called the Ghost Dance, hoping to summon the spirits of fallen warriors back to battle. After the death of Sitting Bull, his brother Chief Bigfoot was persuaded to lead a group of Indians to Wounded Knee Creek to surrender. After Army officers tried to confiscate the Indian rifles, a struggle ensued between some stubborn Indians who would not give up their weapons. The Army opened fire on the Indians, killing over 300 men, women, and children, including Chief Bigfoot. This marked the end of the Indian Wars.